Hello and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into the complex and rapidly unfolding story of Nepal. It's a country nestled right there in the Himalayas, often a quieter player on the global stage, but right now it's really at a critical point. We've carefully gone through a whole stack of sources, reports from Reuters, Al Jazeera, detailed insights from places like Britannica and Wikipedia, and more, just to bring you the clearest possible picture of what's been happening. Okay, so our mission for this deep dive is to cut through those immediate headlines. We want to understand the deeper frustrations that have been simmering for a while. We want to identify the exact spark that ignited this recent unrest, look at the dramatic shifts happening right now, and ultimately explore what it all means, for Nepal's future stability and why it actually matters to all of us globally. You're not just going to get the facts, you'll hopefully gain a richer, more nuanced understanding of the forces really at play here. Born after the monarchy ended back in 2008, seems to have hit some, significant turbulence. It wasn't exactly a sudden crisis, was it?
No, not at all. What our sources really make clear is that this current turmoil didn't just, appear out of thin air. We're seeing the result of, over 15 years of political instability. Since 2008, Nepal's seen, more than a dozen government changes, constant reshuffling of coalitions, endless infighting among the political groups, and that has directly fueled public frustration, especially around things like rampant corruption, blatant nepotism, and just a real lack of meaningful development.
The youth feel this very acutely.
So a lot of promises made back then, but for many people, it sounds like the reality just didn't quite deliver. Precisely. After the 2015 Constitution came in, there was this huge hope for a genuinely democratic, inclusive new Nepal, one with strong institutions, fair participation for everyone. But many Nepalists, particularly those outside the usual power circles, felt that vision just never fully materialized. Power often stayed concentrated with the old elites instead of really decentralizing like it was supposed to. And this gap between the reforms written down and the actual improvements in people's daily lives, that's a really critical insight into where things are now. It really highlights that challenge of, designing institutions versus making them work on the ground. We also see these simmering tensions over decentralization, which promised more local control but often didn't deliver, and issues like caste and ethnic marginalization, especially affecting groups like the Madhesi in the south, they just kept adding to this underlying discontent. It's a really complex mix of grievances. It's also notable, earlier in 2025, there were actually pro-monarchy protests.
Really? Pro-monarchy?
Yeah, a clear signal that at least some people had become so disillusioned with the whole Republican system that they were, maybe nostalgically, looking back to the old ways. Not likely to happen, but telling. These weren't just isolated things, they were symptoms, like pressure points, just building and building.
Okay, so that's the extensive, quite complicated background. But what was the immediate spark? What really set off these huge protests we've been seeing is often those small, maybe administrative decisions that trigger something much, much bigger, right? And here, it starts with something most of us barely think about: social media.
Absolutely. The direct recent trigger was the government trying to enforce these new registration and compliance rules on the big social media platforms. We're talking Facebook, X, YouTube. They were banned because they hadn't registered or followed these new regulations. Now, on the surface, it might look like just a technical regulatory thing, maybe the government trying to get a bit more control.
Right. And what exactly were these rules demanding? Was it about data or content?
Well, our sources suggest they were quite broad. Demanding registration, yes, but also compliance with local laws. Platforms often push back against that stuff, Concerns about data sovereignty, content rules that clash with their global policies, maybe even the potential for censorship down the line. For many people, especially the younger generation, the Gen Z cohort, this ban wasn't just some technicality. Oh no, it immediately felt like an attack on their free expression, their digital rights, their ability to stay informed and organized transparently. This generation, they grew up online. Social media for them is essential. Communication, politics, even jobs. So it felt like a direct challenge to their way of life, a really potent symbol of government overreach.
Okay, so it wasn't just about losing access to cat videos.
Definitely not. And the protests didn't just simmer, they escalated fast. We saw deadly clashes break out between protesters and security forces in several cities. Sources confirm many injuries, and tragically, dozens were killed. In response, the authorities brought in curfews, even deployed the army in Kathmandu. That really underscores how serious the unrest became and how the government's forceful response kind of backfired, escalating what started as a digital rights issue.
Wow. Just shows how quickly things can spiral.
Exactly, especially when those underlying grievances are already so deep.
And the situation moved incredibly fast from there. Streets full of protesters, immense public pressure, and then a major political shakeup right at the top. Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli, who had been leading the country, he resigned. But what does that really mean when a country's already struggling with leadership?
Well, his resignation, coming under that kind of intense public pressure, immediately created a leadership vacuum. And a lot more uncertainty. It was a pretty clear demonstration of the power of sustained public protest, especially driven by that digitally savvy youth. What's crucial, though, are the government's next moves. They quickly lifted the ban on the main social media platforms. That was a direct concession.
Okay, so they backed down on that specific issue.
It did. And
Yeah.
they also promised compensation for victims and investigations into the violence. Now, that's a significant step towards accountability, at least on paper. We'll see how that plays out.
Right. A partial win for the protesters, maybe, but also sounds like a government scrambling a bit. With Oli gone, though, and the unrest still simmering, who steps into that incredibly difficult role? And what about the army being so visible? That seems concerning.
That is the critical question right now. The political scene is so fragmented, finding a consensus leader for an interim government, that's a huge challenge. And yes, our sources confirm the Nepalese army has taken on a much more visible role in maintaining order. Now, stability is obviously vital, but seeing an increased military presence outside the barracks, especially in a relatively young democracy like Nepal's, it definitely raises serious concerns.
Concerns about what, exactly?
About civilian control, about sticking to constitutional norms. You have to ask, is this just temporary, or is it a subtle shift in the power balance? Historically, a strong military presence can be a bit of a double-edged sword. It might restore order short-term, but it could potentially undermine the democratic process long-term.
Okay, and what are the protesters actually demanding now? Is it just about the social media ban still, or has it broadened?
Oh, it's broadened considerably. The demands that have emerged are clear and pretty powerful. People want much greater accountability and transparency from their leaders. That's number one. They're calling for either early elections or a legitimate interim government to steer the ship, and a decisive crackdown on the corruption and nepotism that people feel has just plagued the system for too long. Interestingly, while there isn't widespread desire to bring back the monarchy, there's this undeniable yearning for real systemic reforms. Reforms that actually deliver on those original promises of the new Nepal. They want a system that works for everyone, not just, the well-connected few.
Okay, let's try and unpack this a bit further then. We've got these deep historical issues, this very potent recent trigger, and now a leadership vacuum. How do we even begin to assess Nepal's path forward from here? What factors might actually push it towards stability, and what are the really big risks looming?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, there are certainly some factors that could potentially favor stability. The protests themselves, being so broad-based, cutting across different groups, that shows a really powerful popular demand for change. And the youth involvement specifically could be a strong engine for driving necessary reforms. They seem quite determined.
So the energy is there.
The energy is definitely there. Plus, the fact that the government did respond, partially lifting the ban, promising inquiries, it shows that some institutional checks and balances are still working. Through the courts, the media, civil society. It suggests democratic mechanisms, fragile as they might be, haven't completely broken down. That's a crucial, hopeful sign, perhaps.
That is somewhat reassuring. But it sounds like you're about to list some significant dangers, too.
Absolutely. The risks are substantial, no doubt about it. If these core demands, accountability, real reform, if they go unmet, the protests could easily flare up again, maybe even worse. That would deepen distrust, polarize society even further, and the underlying problems haven't vanished. The fragility of institutions, the deep-rooted corruption, the endless political infighting among the established parties, those are huge obstacles. A major concern, too, is whether any investigations into the recent violence will actually be independent and credible. If people don't trust the process, any remaining public trust just evaporates.
Right. That seems fundamental.
It is. And this also brings up that key point about the interim leadership. Look, a new government could offer a fresh start, a reset, but there's also a very real risk of just an opportunistic power grab or even, a slide towards more authoritarian measures justified by restoring order. The Army's visible role, for instance, remains a constant background concern for democratic norms, especially if it goes beyond just temporary peacekeeping. Our sources really point to this being a critical juncture, a moment where democratic institutions could either be strengthened or quite severely weakened.
And what about the economy in all this? That must be taking a hit.
Oh, definitely. Nepal already faces huge economic challenges. high unemployment, a heavy reliance on money sent home by workers abroad, pressing development needs. Prolonged unrest could seriously disrupt all of that. It could damage the vital tourism sector, scare off any potential investors. And if the youth, who are so central to driving these protests, don't see some rapid improvement in their economic prospects, their disillusionment will only grow, and that could easily fuel more instability down the road.
So looking ahead, what are the likely scenarios we might see play out?
Well, you could see an interim government that genuinely commits to early elections, maybe promises some concrete policy reforms, social media rules, judicial independence, anti-corruption measures. That's one possibility. But if those reforms end up being just superficial, just window dressing, then the protests will almost certainly continue. Social media will remain that potent tool for organizing dissent. And we absolutely cannot ignore the regional pressures. Nepal is squeezed between India and China.
The geopolitical angle.
Exactly. Both giants will be watching very closely. Both have a history of trying to exert influence to protect their interests, ensure stability sometimes, at the expense of Nepal's internal democratic processes. It's a constant tightrope walk for Nepal.
Okay, so we've explored the internal situation, the regional pressures, but let's bring it back home for our listeners. What does all this mean for people listening maybe in Canada or the U.S.? Why should someone in, say, Toronto or Tallahassee care about stability in Nepal?
Yeah, that's a fair question, and it really highlights how interconnected things are now. From the perspective of countries like Canada and the U.S., instability in Nepal actually resonates on several levels. First, bibliomatically. Both countries usually express concern about things like free speech restrictions, internet bans, civilian casualties. Our sources suggest they'll likely issue statements calling for restraint, for independent investigations, basically, upholding democratic norms on the world stage. There are fundamental human rights issues here that cross borders, and they draw attention from global bodies, advocacy groups. It's seen as part of a larger global struggle for digital freedom and democracy.
Okay, so there's a values and human rights dimension. What else?
Well, economically, Nepal gets significant foreign aid and money sent home by the diaspora Nepalists living abroad, including many in North America. That's a crucial lifeline for their economy. So instability could increase pressure for more international aid, maybe humanitarian assistance. And countries with large Nepali communities, like Canada, might feel pressure from those communities to act or provide support.
Makes sense. And the geopolitics we touched on.
Absolutely crucial. Nepal's location between India and China makes its stability a regional, even a global concern. If instability continues, it could potentially shift regional power dynamics. The U.S. and Canada generally support democratic governance, and they see a stable Nepal as important for regional balance, particularly in a region where the U.S. is often trying to counterbalance Chinese influence. A stable, democratic, independent Nepal is generally preferred over one that's chaotic or easily influenced by external powers.
So it fits into that bigger strategic picture.
It does. And then there are more direct potential impacts. Prolonged instability can, sadly, lead to increased migration, maybe even refugee flows. Nepali citizens might seek asylum elsewhere. And diaspora communities often become very active in lobbying their home governments in places like Canada and the U.S. to take action internationally. Finally, there's soft power. Countries like Canada and the U.S. engage with Nepal through NGOs, educational exchanges, scholarships, cultural diplomacy. These connections can help support civil society, independent media, democratic values over the long term, all vital for sustained stability.
This has been a remarkably thorough look at what's clearly a very complex and still evolving situation. If Nepal is going to truly stabilize, if it's going to move towards that sustainable, inclusive governance everyone hoped for, what are the absolute essential actions it needs to take? What does that roadmap look like, especially with all these internal and external pressures we've discussed?
Well, drawing from our sources, it seems a path forward really involves several key interconnected steps. It's not just one thing. Firstly, and perhaps most urgently, there have to be transparent and genuinely credible investigations into the recent violence, with real accountability for anyone found responsible. This isn't just about justice. It's fundamental for rebuilding any kind of trust between the government and the people. Without that, legitimacy is just impossible.
Okay, accountability first. What's next?
Secondly, substantial political reforms are clearly essential. We're talking potentially changes to electoral laws for fairer representation, stronger checks on executive power to prevent abuses, and radically more transparency in how government works, specifically to tackle that deep-seated corruption. The challenge, of course, is making sure these reforms are real, not just cosmetic changes.
Right, deep structural changes.
Exactly. Thirdly, governance needs to be truly inclusive. That means actively bringing in the voices of the youth, marginalized groups, civil society, moving beyond just the traditional political elites who've held power for so long. And the how of that means creating real ways for people to participate, not just token gestures.
Makes sense. What else?
Fourth, economic reforms are critical, with a really sharp focus on creating jobs, especially for young people, and policies designed to reduce the stark inequality that exists. Addressing those root causes of economic frustration can provide tangible benefits and, maybe just as importantly, hope for the future. That's a powerful antidote to unrest.
Hope is key. And number 5.
Fifth, ensuring robust digital freedom seems paramount now. Given what sparked this latest crisis, any future rules around social media have to be very carefully designed to protect citizens' rights to express themselves and organize, not become tools to suppress dissent. That's critical now. These platforms are so central to civic life.
Okay. And finally,
The interim government, whatever form it takes, must establish a clear, legitimate roadmap, whether it's for elections or some other democratic mechanism. This provides a predictable path back to renewed democratic legitimacy and a stable transition of power. Without that clear path, the current uncertainty will just drag on, potentially fueling more cycles of protest and instability. It's definitely a long, tough road ahead, but these steps seem absolutely foundational based on everything we've seen.
and that brings us towards the end of this deep dive into Nepal's recent turbulence. We've explored how decades of, well, political instability, unfulfilled promises, those underlying frustrations, how they erupted when that social media ban was imposed, sparking these powerful protests led by a generation really determined to make their voices heard. We've looked at the immediate aftermath leadership changes, that complex interplay of risks and opportunities shaping the nation's future, and how Nepal is trying to navigate this incredibly delicate balance right now. Hopefully you've gained some insight into why these events in Nepal really do reverberate far beyond its own borders, touching on universal human rights, global geopolitics, even international migration patterns. It's quite a stark reminder of how interconnected our world really is. So as we conclude, here's something to maybe think about. In our increasingly digital world where communication is instant and global, how will this ongoing battle for digital rights and freedom of expression, especially driven by youth movements, continue to reshape governance?
How will it spark change in democracies or maybe even challenge authoritarian regimes all around the globe? What really stands out to you about the undeniable power of a connected generation in this evolving landscape? Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. We look forward to exploring another crucial topic with you next time.